Okay, let's get started. We do actually have a really great full program today, so I want to make sure we leave lots of time for discussion and Q&A. Thank you all for joining us again. This is actually, I realized, week 6 of our virtual town hall, and 6 weeks in for a lot of craziness for a lot of people. So really do appreciate you taking your time to spend an hour with us and hopefully learn from our incredible members who are putting themselves out there and trying to keep us all informed about really crucial topics. We do have some great topics again today. We're going to hear from ML Strategies, R&Q Solutions, and Grant Thornton. Just as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand or pop them in the chat bot, and we'll interrupt the speakers. We hope that this will be really helpful for you. Please feel free to ask questions, but keep yourself muted while you're not speaking so we don't have a lot of background noise. From MassMedic, again, thank you. We have a list of really incredible webinars coming up that I will put in the chat bot. I want to make sure you all know the things that we're putting on that you can be a part of, including our Women in MedTech series. And then we also encourage you to go to our website to check out our COVID-19 resource page. There's a lot of up-to-date information and just some thoughts on getting back to work and resources that you really want to be tapping into. So please feel free to do that. I think we're just going to get started, and I'm going to kick things off with Anthony Tamayo from ML Strategies. So Anthony, if you want to take yourself off mute, this would be awesome.
Hello, and thank you for having me again. How is everyone? I actually have a few slides which I'm going to try to share. I think I figured out how to do it yesterday. So let me make sure that I can do that correctly. Share screen, slideshow. Great. Rachel, can you see that? Can everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Okay. So I thought today, since it's extremely topical, we would talk a bit about the interim legislation that's going to be, well, it's under debate right now in the House, but expected to pass early this afternoon and get signed and hopefully start flowing money, even before the weekend. So as you probably know, particularly if you've been involved in or participated in these previous webinars, there have been 3 major COVID-19 related bills to move through Congress. The third, the CARES Act, was by far the biggest, and one of the biggest bills ever, at over $2 trillion. A lot of spending both for economic recovery and clinical needs. This is not, we're not calling it the 4th bill. It is really just an extension of the CARES Act. So CARES 2.0, interim bill, whatever, you might hear called a couple of different things, but basically what it does is add money without changing any of the policies of the last big stimulus bill called the CARES Act. So what was especially interesting to many in the device industry in the CARES Act was this Paycheck protection program, just sort of a novel SBA, Small Business Administration program, which provided sort of bridge loans, but really they convert to grants. So kind of free money amounting to 8 weeks of payroll for qualifying businesses, small businesses with 500 employees or fewer. As was expected, that initial $349 billion made available by the CARES Act was exhausted pretty quickly. So I think it was last Thursday, after just 2 weeks, or maybe even a day short of 2 weeks of accepting applications for PPP loans, that initial $349 billion ran out, and hopefully today or tomorrow, the next sort of tranche of $310 billion will become available. So as I said at the top, no changes to the terms or application procedure. for these loans. We went over it extensively in a previous webinar. There's plenty of information and fact sheets out there if you need it. But basically, these loans are administered by your bank or by your lending partner, rather than going directly to the government, the SBA. The SBA has delegated this authority to banks. So I think if you haven't yet, or if you applied and didn't get a loan, and you are interested, you should check in with your bank today or soon, because they will presumably start accepting applications again Friday or probably Monday at the latest, I think.
Anthony,
If
can
you
I
have,
chime in with
yeah,
a
go ahead.
question real quick?
Sure,
You
sure.
you may be about to answer this, but just if they have applied and are potentially in the queue, so banks have said, hey, we've got your information. Do they need to apply again? Have they said anything about how banks should be handling this?
Yeah, well, what we've heard is that they won't have to apply again, but we've also heard from the SBA that the best course of action for an applicant is to contact the bank. And if the bank says, resubmit, then just resubmit. You're not gonna, you won't accept 2 loans. So that would be the only problem, as long as you just accept one. But there's been a lot of administrative problems since the rollout of this, and it's smoothing out. But the sort of the herky-jerky start and stop has been challenging and hard to manage. So everybody from the SBA to Bank of America to Middlesex Savings Bank is asking for patience. So just try to be as open and communicative as possible with your lender. Another, and this probably doesn't apply to a lot of the businesses in this industry, but it's worth mentioning. This program is called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and it's a much smaller. It's not a forgivable loan. I think that's a $2 million cap on these, but it's restricted based on a company's revenue. So it's really intended for small businesses, but it's worth mentioning because it too ran out of money appropriated in the CARES Act. So you may have heard of if you're eligible for an EIDL and you make the application through the SBA, as soon as your application is accepted, you get a $10,000 grant, and that is not part of the loan. That's separate, and you don't have to apply for forgiveness or anything. But again, it probably doesn't apply to many in mass medic, but it's worth checking out. I'm a little bit stuck. Okay. This is probably most interesting to your customers, but worth tracking because, of course, that's an important relationship. The CARES Act, as you probably know, authorized Senator Schumer and others called the sort of a Marshall Plan for hospitals, which was $100 billion in spending for hospitals and other providers. Just yesterday, HHS, which is responsible for administering the money, made some announcements about how it's going to be. The first distribution under the general allocation was $30 billion, and that was made, I think it was completed April 17th. And that went basically by formula, Medicare fee-for-service allocation based on last year's billings or collections, I guess. So evenly across the board. The same will be true of the next general allocation tranche, which is going to come tomorrow, and that's going to represent the rest of that $50 billion. So $20 billion total, and those deposits will be made into providers' accounts, on a rolling weekly basis. The first of which is tomorrow, the 24th. Also yesterday, they announced excuse me, they announced $10 billion targeted allocation, which is specifically for hotspots that have, sort of been uh, uh, disproportionately affected by the pandemic. They also followed up but didn't give hard numbers on an announcement made earlier this month that a portion of the total $100 billion in the CARES Act is going towards making sure the uninsured get the COVID care that they need. Obviously, this is more important to states that did not expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, but it has not been met with much resistance. They also announced yesterday of that initial $100 billion, $10 billion will go to rural hospitals, $400 million to the Indian Health Service, and other disbursements will be made for other providers, including dentists, skilled nursing facilities, and otherwise. So more details to come, but it is a sort of a slow roll from HHS. Now that's the CARES Act. Congress recognized in the past couple of weeks during negotiations that $100 billion was not going to be enough. So interim bill that's under consideration now, probably passed this afternoon, another $100 billion. And you'll see up here on the screen that it's got some breakdown in the legislation, which will then be further broken down. That $75 billion at the top, that's going to HHS just the same as the first $100 billion. It'll be distributed based on their sort of what they determine to be the formula or the prop up hospitals that have lost revenue due to canceling elective care. The $25 billion balance is exclusively for testing, and that runs from research and development all the way to capacity expansion, everything in between. And you can see the breakdown here, which may be interesting for any members that are in the testing space. $11 billion is going to states and municipalities based on formula and hotspot targeting, and especially earmarked for Indian health organizations to expand their local testing. $1 billion to the CDC, almost $2 billion to NIH, another $1 billion to BARDA, which has really been quarterbacking all of the clinical response and applications for funding from the private sector. A modest amount to the FDA, and almost $1 billion for community health centers and rural clinics. Importantly, you'll see this $1 billion here for testing the uninsured. That is separate and apart from the money committed in the first bill for caring for the uninsured. Any questions, Rachel, on this? Anything come in?
We did have a question.
Sure.
So if you already have an SBA loan,
okay.
There seemed to be a thought that you could ask for forgiveness in the next 6 months, and that might include principal and interest. Have you heard anything about current SBA loans that may be able to be used for anything that might be forgiven?
Not as in an SBA loan that is not a PPP loan, like a previous 7A loan. Yeah, I don't. I will have to get back to you and get the right answer for that.
Okay.
I don't want to give you a wrong answer, but
Okay.
there are, I don't want to call it forgiveness, but there are definitely deferments and or deferrals on SBA loans and other government-backed loans. So I'll just get I know there's a one sheet somewhere that I can get to you for that.
Thanks. That'd be awesome. Yeah, we'll share it with everybody afterwards.
Okay.
Anthony, this is Brian.
Sure.
Can you just give us a sense of the bandwidth? So we're 6 weeks in, we've seen 4 major federal spending packages. When does the bandwidth run out in terms of the government's willingness to continue to write big checks? Any thoughts you can give us on that?
Well, It's a good question, and I think it's sort of unknowable. Mitch McConnell has signaled that he's getting tired of, or that he's not willing to do legislation from afar anymore, which would indicate that he wants actual, deliberative process. Um, I just don't see how that's possible, until we get on the other side of this. And the pressure is still on, well beyond healthcare for another significant stimulus bill. And by all accounts, that's moving through the House, and proposals are being crafted and being honed, and I'm working on several right now in different sectors. And like, by all accounts, it's something for the month of May, at least, if not mid-May, the end of May. And it's hard to say what comes after that, but we are all expecting another, fairly big price tag on that one. So, I'm not sure the extent of the appetite, but I don't think anybody wants to be responsible for any, serious long-term contraction that they could have avoided by, borrowing from the future.
Right. And then theoretically, states are going to need bailouts too, right? As revenues crater.
Yeah, and that's another thing that McConnell in the Senate has been now vocally resistant about. He all but said, let the states go bankrupt and shed their pension obligations yesterday, and I think that's terribly unpopular. Certainly in blue states, certainly in Massachusetts, but it just absolute non-starter for someone like Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi. So I would expect to see more support going to the states, but it's unclear now what it looks like.
Thank you for that color. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And I know this is only sort of tangentially relevant, but I thought it was worth going through the hospital funding. If there's any questions on it, happy to try to answer it. And again, the announcement on the allocation for the CARES money, which is slow, like I said, slowly rolling out, was only yesterday, so we're still trying to get some answers on it. And hearing none, I'll move on. This was Sunday night, I believe, was the 19th. Yeah, this came out from CMS, and again, this is relevant to your customers more than you directly, but it is an idea of where CMS is going in terms of non-emergent care coming back online, at least in places that have not seen or have stabilized their cases of COVID-19. There's still a lot of gray area here. The guidance made clear that this was the first of many guidance documents to come out, or memos, I think they were called. But it did kind of give some broad priorities and guidelines, focused mostly on surgical and procedural care and chronic disease management, as to be expected, but also left the door open for some preventive care. And so that's kind of where the line blurs from, what's elective and what isn't, and and it could be a lobbyable issue. We'll have to see how that's handled, as some of these providers and facilities decide that they've met the gating criteria and made the general considerations needed to sort of open up some of this care. What's interesting, they've established some protocols or some recommendations for what they're calling NCC zones, non-COVID care zones. They want to be as separated as possible from the rest of the facility. Makes perfect sense, but is maybe difficult to do in depending on existing design. So we'll see how hospitals and other provider centers are able to accommodate that. And of course, as you can expect, they put a huge emphasis on maintaining resources in the event that a surge comes later. And that makes, I think, good sense to everyone, but is sort of hard to quantify. So I think there's still not a lot of clarity, and it's still early stages, but it's clear that the administration is beginning to focus on getting back towards at least some of the canceled procedures, which I'm sure many of you support with your devices. And so this is just, and understanding that we're not all in a position to be thinking long term. I'm certainly not. I'm sort of in the throes of the right now. But I've talked to a lot of people in your space and in the pharmaceutical space about what comes next. And I think that we're not focused a lot on that bill in May. For clinical needs, we're thinking more of an economic relief package. So what's left now? And it'll depend on how effective this $100 or $200 billion is in sort of sustaining the healthcare system and the healthcare delivery system. Before we know what we need, what more support we need. But there are a couple of things that are for sure. There is no normal anymore. There's no returning back to a pre-COVID pandemic way of life in this sector. Maybe in any sector, but certainly in healthcare delivery. There are a lot of open questions regarding the supply chain. I don't think that we could just turn it on its head and achieve what some people have asked for of making every medical device and all of its pieces in the United States. But there is a lot of bipartisan support for scaling back dependence on China, and you'll see the drumbeat on that continue, I think, well after this is resolved, assuming it's resolved. And then telehealth is an interesting point. I know people in Washington who have made a career working on telehealth and trying to, pave the way for that and get it to a point where it's safe, reliable, secure, and usable. And this pandemic has sort of jolted it into necessity. It leaves some work to do, but it also opens some questions about, for device companies in particular, in addition to virtual visits, provider visits, what can you do now via telehealth? Can you monitor, control, secure hardware remotely? Can you update it with new software? Can you train providers on it remotely? All that seems to be possible and something that others are thinking about. So it's, to the extent that we're able to do some long-term planning, those are some sort of open questions that are worth maybe considering. And I'm sorry I don't have the answers to them, but
I do have a question from the group. So
Sure.
regarding the CMS guidance,
yeah.
is that contingent? So is this just guidance that is now contingent on the states, the governor's decisions and timing for this? So
Yeah.
they're just saying, here's what you should do, but now it's up to each state?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, Medicare doesn't have the authority to tell you to open up, or to do anything that the governor says you can't. So state and local public health decrees, regulations, whatever, are still, the hospitals are still going to have to defer to them. But they're sort of, I think, guidelines to help guide state health departments and also the providers.
Awesome. Thank
And
you.
in fact, right in it, it does make that very clear. So.
Okay. That's so appreciated. So thank you. I think that was probably the last question we have time for, but I think that was great. Thank you so much, Anthony.
No, my pleasure, and always nice to see everybody. Thank you very much for having me.
So I think this is a great part to transition to Ron Sills from Regulatory and Quality Solutions. So we asked Ron to kind of come on and give us a quick update on MDR. So legislation went through. There was a vote last week. MDR has been pushed. What does that actually mean? And what are the implications for companies looking to take advantage of that? So Ron, I think this is a great point for you to take over.
Okay, thanks Rachel and Brian for having me here today. So good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I mean, so the delay of EU MDR, finally driven by, the COVID-19 situation, is we've seen a lot of companies now shift their business priorities. They're having shortfalls in sales, because of all the elective procedures not being done anymore. So their typical, revenue streams have been interrupted. So we're seeing many companies, even smaller non-medical companies, jumping in and looking to produce, goods and services that address the needs of the pandemic and healthcare. I think from when you think about large corporations with stockholders and so many stakeholders, with their revenues being interrupted, this causes them definitely to shift their priorities. And of course, there's also a lot of compassion and interest in just, supporting the healthcare industry as it's so much needed. Again, the delay was kind of hoped for and prayed for and anticipated by so many people for so long for various reasons, due to lack of approved notified bodies, overall lack of readiness. But of course, this kind of pushed it over the edge. And so I think everybody's kind of expected the delay based on COVID-19. But here we are. From the notified body perspective, they had to shift their focus a couple of times now. So, as they applied and got approved, there was only about 12 right now that are approved. Nothing's really happened in the last few months. They had shifted beginning over a year ago to doing more MDR type assessments. And even the ones they were doing under MDD were much more rigorous and incorporated some of the approach and mindset and the expectations under MDR. So they had already shifted, they had ramped up resources and their whole business plan and how they go about doing things. At the same time, they were extending MDD certificates, as we know, so that's still unchanged even under the delay. So products that have certificates valid up to 2024 will still, that'll still be allowed. So that's unchanged. But again, they now have to consider, if companies aren't ready for MDR, there's no way to really kind of force them to do MDR. So they may have to shift back and do more MDD type assessments and extend more certificates than they had originally planned for. The delay also incorporated the November 2019 core addendum around the Class 1 reusable, Class 1R, which is a new designation under MDR for anything that's reprocessed and reused in the hospital. So any company who did or has a declaration of conformity between now and the new date of next year, that's still valid up until 2024. So that incorporated that. Again, I think there will be still an EU MDR type of focus even under the MDD, because we've seen that already continuously, around things like clinical evaluation reporting, post-market surveillance, and PMCF. Those things were already being expected, at least having plans in place and at least piloting some of the initial PMS plans and PMCF reports and the other post-market type of reporting that's required under MDR. In terms, again, of the notified bodies, there is a guidance that was published this year by the Medical Device Collaboration Group. As we know, that group was born out of the MDR to provide guidance on how to interpret and apply and be ready for the MDR, both for manufacturers and notified bodies. So they did release one 2020-4 guidance, which was all around doing virtual assessments now. So with notified bodies being grounded like everybody else in terms of travel, they are conducting virtual assessments. I worked as a notified body auditor for many years, And I can tell you this is going to be really challenging because, first of all, it's always been required that you're actually on site, you see the physical facility, and, it's one thing to look at documents and do a desktop review, but once you get onto the production floor, especially, you see things that you would never see otherwise. So not being able to do that is going to be really challenging for the auditors. The accessibility of documentation, trying to get the things that you need to look at in terms of procedures and records, accessibility of key personnel, and then just trying to coordinate everything virtually. So are the right people going to be there for you to ask questions to? But yeah, especially not being able to be on site to see the physical facility is a real burden. I would expect to see, more nonconformities around that issue, because when you're doing desktop, assessments, and you may not have everybody there, and they may not have access to the right documentation. You're not talking to the right person. At some point, you kind of move on. You say, okay, well, you haven't shown me evidence of compliance, so this is going to be a nonconformity. Let's just move on to the next area. So I would expect to see some of that. And it's not that they don't have the evidence; they just may not have had it readily available. So that happens a lot in virtual type auditing or assessments. This does not affect the IVDR, as we know, but I've seen cases already where companies which operate under both MDR and IVDR, they've obviously scaled back and changed their priorities under MDR. And that's also affecting the mindset on the IVDR side of their businesses. So, it's affecting how they prepare for that. That's still only 2 years away. And as we know, 2 years is not a long time to get ready for either one of these. So, they have to be careful about how they do that. Some of the companies are working on, tests and assays for COVID-19, which is certainly a higher priority. So I don't blame them for doing that, but you can't totally discount having to be ready for both direct regulations. The cost of regulatory compliance is always there. That's not going to change. It's not going to be any cheaper to do it this year or next year as opposed to this year. Whether you're doing it with your own people or using consultants, we work with a lot of companies. So that's not going to change. I mean, regulatory compliance doesn't help the bottom line. It never does. When you do submissions, it always costs money, but that's the cost of doing business, and that's all built in, and everybody knows that. But it's certainly not going to get any cheaper over time. From my standpoint, I think what companies can really focus on to get ready for MDR is their QMS side. So, if they haven't done so already, and most of, a lot of companies have, but this is the time to really get in place all of your QMS processes, your procedures, get everything up to date, because there's clear requirements in the MDR under, what the QMS should be set up to do. I mean, your QMS is always there to drive regulatory compliance, whether it's MDR or FDA or whatever. So this is the time now to get everything updated, get your procedures, your manual, designate your person responsible for regulatory, get those requirements in place. Annex 2 and 3 are new under the MDR, so your technical documentation. There are, standard formats, whether it's STED format or just going right from Annex 2, which is basically like a STED format. But yeah, getting all that in place, having all those things ready. So when you have to start testing your products or retesting them, or all the things that you have to do around validation and risk assessment, at least you have all the processes in place. You could have protocols in place, templates for reporting in place. Make sure you have people and processes ready to do, the adverse reporting, which will be, 15 days as opposed to 30 days. So making sure you're ready to do all those things. So I think now's the time in the interim between now and next year to get all those things ready and going. So then you're ready to jump back into it in terms of getting your product submissions and your tech files up to date. And that's what I have for now, Rachel.
So Ron, it sounds like from a getting ready for a virtual audit perspective, do as much as you possibly can. The onus is probably going to be on the companies to have as much available at the time of discussion as possible, right? So the last thing you want to do is show up and be unprepared. So it sounds like over prepare is the idea.
Yeah, definitely. And as an auditor, you always kind of expected that anyways. One of the most frustrating things was to give an audit plan and says, okay, we're gonna check your supplier controls, and then when you ask for approved supplier list, it takes 3 hours to get it. It's like, well, you probably should have had that ready, and so that doesn't really help. But yeah, definitely over preparing is the key there, and having the right people, the right subject matter experts or the responsible persons, from top management and otherwise.
And I mean, having been an auditor, I would imagine it does make you a little bit cranky when you expect to have things and things aren't readily available. So I would think it's probably going to be even tougher now remotely. That's a good question from Bill. Do you think they're going to be doing these with video media, Zoom, or I mean, are they?
Oh yeah, they're doing it now. Yeah, it's already being done like that.
So they've started it. Okay.
Yeah, I've talked to some of my former colleagues, and they are doing it, and it's. We actually, about a year ago when I was still at the auditing end of things, we did we did like opening meetings and some pre-assessments by video. We kind of piloted some of that. We were allowed to do, a small percentage of the audit that way. So I know we had piloted it a little bit, but yeah, now it's pretty much all virtual, and they are ongoing already.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One last question I would ask you before we move on. Other than CMS documentation, it sounds like that's absolutely something that should be focused on. Anything else you're advising your clients to do to kind of stay the course? It sounds like if you can keep doing what you're doing, don't stop now. I would imagine if you're doing testing, stopping in the middle and saying, I'm going to pick it up next year would be even more expensive than if you just stayed the course.
Yeah, that's a good question, because, if you started a validation test now and, say you have samples, say you're doing, sterile product, and maybe that product is not even good enough for validations a year from now. Maybe you have to start over. Maybe you've decided to make some changes between now and next year, design changes, and now you have to, kind of start over and make sure you have representative, product to be tested.
Kate, that's a great question. So Kate chimed in and said she'd be ready to start the certification process in July. Can she still go MDD route?
That's really up to the notified body. Like I said, they'd already tried to shift everybody over to MDR assessments this year, or starting last year. But yeah, I think there's going to have to be some flexibility, especially probably for lower risk products where they've been on the market for a while, or they might have to reconsider some of the extensions, I would think.
Okay, awesome. I don't want to cut anybody off, so if there's any more questions, please pump into the chat bot and we'll make sure Ron gets them. And Ron, you all at R&Q are still working actively with clients to help develop their plans. So if anyone has specific questions, they can absolutely reach out to you.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, cool. I'll make sure everyone gets your information in our follow-up email.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, so we have one more awesome session to get to. So Yvette and Pat from Grant Thornton are going to share with us. I think they're both on the call. I didn't see you guys jump on, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Brian, for the opportunity. So basically, we're going to be talking about how companies can respond and restore to some level of normalcy after the crisis, or during and after the crisis. With us today and on the call will be Yvette Connor, who's going to be leading the discussion, Andy Mekovic, Lisa Walkush, and myself. We're all part of the life sciences practice at Grant Thornton. And what I wanted to do before turning it over to Yvette is just give a brief view of what we're seeing with medical device companies. I think most notable is the incredible number of emergency use authorizations that we've been seeing. As of yesterday, I checked on the site, and upwards of 60 authorizations for personal protective equipment, in vitro diagnostics, more complex tests, and of course ventilators. What's interesting is this so overwhelms what has happened in the past. The last one was the Zika virus back in 2016, and others back in 2015, 2014, and 2013. But this bolus of activity is unprecedented. I also wanted to share, we've in the normal course of our conversations with clients and with industry, we've observed certain things. And as of yesterday, I had been on a recent call with a number of large manufacturers who are all participating in the FDA's case for quality. And everyone had said that they've pretty much ramped up their manufacturing for the most part, especially if it's pandemic-related activity, including additional shifts. What's interesting is, of course, the workforce is there on the shop floor, but everyone else is doing shelter in place. We're all familiar with that. A brief update today, though, one of the manufacturers that was on the call just announced today that they are expecting a 60% drop in their US revenues. That even though some of their activity has ticked up with respect to the virus, overall, they're losing 60% of their market. So big shift from when I had spoken to them a little over three weeks ago. As far as small and medium, mid-tier med device companies, everyone's expressed some relief over the EU MDR delay, so that was good. However, a number of them, in fact, one we just found out today, has basically gone to a 4-day work week and 20% pay cut. So there is substantial impact to liquidity for some of the MedTech companies that we're speaking with. And then the last piece that I want to share was on a DIA, which is all pharma, of course, call, but basically they had reported that FDA is currently meeting PDUFA and MDUFA timelines, but they expected that if the current pace of activity continues, that delays in drug approvals are possible and device approvals are likely. So, we can expect a lot of disruption even with the agency as well. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Walkush. Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of what you're seeing?
Thanks, Pat. I think the only other thing that I would add is, we are obviously watching the CARES Act as well, and there's a couple provisions in there that on the other end of this, we're anticipating could impact our drug and device clients, and it's provisions around potential additional information reporting up to FDA, really tightening up your risk management plans, and then also HHS is going to be initiating a study by the National Academies of Sciences looking at the security and resiliency of the U.S. Supply chain. So getting back to, how reliant are we on China and other areas of the world. Obviously, industry will have an opportunity to submit information. So we're watching that timeline. It looks like the study's going to be requested. We have a date of May 26th right now. So we'll be watching that and then sharing that information as it moves forward. That's it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to turn this over to Yvette Connor now, and I'll operate the slides for Yvette.
Thanks, Pat, and greetings, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. I'm also noting the time, so if I talk a little bit fast, bear with me. I want to just show some things and get your wheels turning around how we're approaching the pandemic resiliency and conversations with clients and really discussions around, what does it mean? Where do we go from here? And how do I begin to think about it in terms of an impact to my business? So the first thing we like to show is a little bit academic, which deals with a lot of things that you've heard probably at this point in time. First and foremost, pandemics go in waves. This one probably will not be different in the absence of a perfect vaccine. And by that, I mean an MMR polio sort of vaccine versus a flu immunization or partial vaccine. So we're really looking at something that's going to have peaks and valleys. It's going to go over a time period, and we are all well aware that we're at a level 6 pandemic. What really matters is the bottom of the slide, which is the importance of prioritizing where you're at now in terms of what you should do next. What are the sort of value and risk trade-offs of the things you would want to consider, and then getting to it. So what we talk about with the terms we use is really respond and recover. So what is the optimal response you should do now? That includes a whole bunch of things we're going to quickly run through in the time we have left. We've boiled it down to 4 areas that we think you should focus on. And then the object is to really, as we get to the next slide, you'll see, get to a point of restoration. But it's important to really understand this is not a one and done. I think a lot of folks do understand that. I'm just really reinforcing it with this slide. And then with that, Pat, let's pop to the next slide. Let me show you what I mean by respond and recover. Really what we're trying to get to is effective survival of a period of distress and avoiding solvency events, making sure there's enough cash to carry you through to July 1st. And that is a timeline that we're targeting for some reasons that deal with a lot of the modeling we do with public health epidemiologists and virologists. And Grant Thornton's been building pandemic models for regulatory approval since 2013. So we actually have our hand deep into this with strong academic knowledge and partnerships around this topic. And our models have gone through regulatory approval actually. So we can talk with some level of affirmation about our ability to understand how a disease moves and manages in terms of business impact. And with that in mind, what we really want to think about is getting through the immediate period in a crisis management mode, which most of us are in, business continuity crisis management, really focusing on what you need to do next and why for purposes of that recovery. The object of the game is to get to stabilization and growth in a period of, for many, significant distress, which means you have to get creative. You have to look at lots of different balls in the air at one time, and you have to prioritize. And so we think there's some ways that you can go about that that will get you ahead of the game. What we want to do is avoid the items in teal, which really drop down beneath, if you will, this sort of roller coaster at the top. Things like hope and respond or reduced in rate, weight, reactive things, right? Reactive things that people are, well, let's wait and see what happens with the reopen. Let's wait and see what happens in the state. We would advise against that. Most of our clients are thinking solidly 16 weeks down the road. That's where their head's at. Some of them are already to 12, 31, 20, redoing their financial planning and analysis forecasts and building scenarios around those forecasts, which we are very much in support of. So with that, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more specifically about why all this matters on the curve. So in my shop, I lead risk advisory at Grant Thornton as it relates to enterprise risk. And so I understand a lot about life sciences and healthcare, the compliance matrices that you're subject to, all of the regulatory aspects thereof, and the fact that stuff goes wrong. And it does go wrong. And whether we're talking product and recall or liability, whether we're talking customer engagement, supply and demand, we talked about supply chain already on this call. These are all things that can go great, and these are all things that could not go great. And that's just a day in the life. So when we look at the curve in front of you, you kind of see in the middle, it says equipment failure. Well, for someone that's in the manufacturing business, like all of y'all are, a day in the life. We could have an unscheduled maintenance breakdown that creates some sort of problem, and we're going to need to resolve it. But those problems also operate on a curve, a scale, if you will. To the left of this curve, what you see are the big things, and they get bigger the farther you go to the left. So when we look at the pandemic, the reason this slide exists is because what it's encouraging you to appreciate is the potential severity beyond the normal. And when something becomes catastrophic, which a pandemic is, and again, most of you are probably already accepting that. When something is catastrophic, what is different about a pandemic is that unlike an earthquake, hurricane, right, floods, the time duration is significant. That's the different variable here. And it's one that requires a level of creativity in order to generate resiliency. So you have to explore some things differently, challenge some things differently. So on the curve, you're going to see it sitting down there right next to nuclear event. Nuclear event is the only catastrophic, truly catastrophic sort of event that we would talk about in risk or performance that lasts longer than a pandemic. Think about that for a minute. Lasts longer. So time is the enemy here, and time is what we need to solve for. So when we begin to think about different ways to reduce the negative impact to your business, in other words, we're going to look to the right of this curve and chase that green plus sign. That's where we have to focus on our time and effort. And with that, let's get to how we might do it. Next slide, Pat. So there's a lot of variables in a pandemic. There's over 500 variables, I kid you not, 500 variables that my team it interprets and manages things like GDP down to the county and state level, unemployment numbers, certain locations of plants, distribution centers, social distancing movement, cell phone movement, lots of things that we pay attention to that all, sort of go into the recipe mix of how you begin to figure out what a pandemic means to any one client. But you can take all of those variables and package them and talk to your senior leaders in a much more simplified manner that says, okay, let's boil this down to 4 key things. It's going to be driven off the wheel to the right. And let's first look at what matters. What most businesses want to have happen in a normal scenario is they want to grow. They like to protect their brand, which helps growth. They want to be resilient enterprises, which means when bad things happen, it doesn't bring them to their knees. And they want to hit financial targets, especially those that are publicly traded, but even those that are private. You still have stakeholders. So you're playing to all 4 of those objects. Those are goals, right? In order to get to those goals, normally, we could even boil your business model down into 4 components. It takes people to do it. You have to manage the bad stuff that can come at you. And let's just go back to flood, tornado, bad weather, etc. You could do all of that. And then you also have how your customer behaves and how your supply chain behaves. Let's call that business operations. So you have people, business ops. You have things that could go wrong on the outside that you're paying attention to, especially in risk. And then we have liquidity and cash flow management. So we've sort of taken the whole business and basically said, we're going to oversimplify it. Why does that matter? Because over to the left, we're going to talk about how you specifically can manage a pandemic through that lens, right? How you can manage a pandemic through this lens. So how do we optimize cash flow, liquidity, and solvency? What do we know? What do we think we don't know? What options are available? Let's go do it. Let's put them on a list. How do we think about supply and demand? What do we know about the elasticity of our product? All right, fine, elective procedures have gone away. Let's forecast that out. Let's scenario analysis that. Can we repurpose any of these devices, which some of you have already done, especially in the ventilator space, right? Or gone into, if you will, repurposing your manufacturing flow. You also have to think about in that these external factors that still exist. Now here, in the 3rd category, you actually have some positive news. An external factor is what the US government chooses to do or what a state chooses to do. What might they choose to do? Well, how about money, right? Government funding. The whole SBA program, we talked about it earlier, perhaps more money coming, looks like it will, right? That's the good news. What about tax credits? That's good news. So when you really think about the financial planning and analysis, recasting liquidity and cash flow, recasting a growth analysis, thinking about quality and brand, this is the good stuff that can help you as you manage through that. Last but not least is people. Now, I said what makes a pandemic truly unique is its duration. Absolute truth. But there's another thing that makes it unique in the world of catastrophe. It impacts people differently than any other type of catastrophe. Fundamentally, a human disease can only live in a human host. Well, cats now, right? They found some cats. But for the most part, we're talking about humans. What does that mean? It means that when you think about a business impact, what is your critical dependency is all about people. Everything happening in a pandemic, decisions to open or stay closed, this whole work from home, shelter in place, how we move around or don't move around, the criticality of sickness and absenteeism. What is it? It's all people. It's all people, number 1 variable. So when we think about a business impact, we have to think about how people are impacted, not only in the disease progression, the virology, if you will, and the epidemiology, if you will. It's the actual use of people in your business, whether they're selling your product, delivering your product, maintaining or servicing your product, using it in a surgery, manufacturing it. You get the picture. All of it hangs together, and it all also correlates to money, right? If you can't use people the way you need to use them to deliver your goods and services, make your goods and services, sell your goods and services, your revenue will be impacted. Your liquidity and cash flow will be impacted. So it has to be looked at in an integrated manner, but these 4 things are essentially your 360. And if you work through them with your teams and talk about these kind of scenarios, model them out, pull the customer demand information, look at your market segmentation, work with your FP&A team, you will be more resilient. So to help facilitate this, we've developed an online tool that you can take free. We'll generate a scorecard free. And we'll include the things I've talked about for free at a higher level. They won't be ultimately customized to you. That's clearly another body of work. And we're happy to help you with that. And we are helping a lot of folks with that. But we'll kickstart you, right? We'll kickstart you, and you can go here to do it. And takes about 30 minutes. You can circulate it all around in your business, and it generates a scorecard that we'll show you some samples of. And I want to invite Andy into the conversation. He kindly joined me today. Andy's an expert in tax and also an expert in government funding. And Andy, there's 2 questions. First and foremost, let's talk about the human capital labor one. Secondly, we did have a question about the SBA loan and some of the requirements that I know you know well in relation to retaining your workforce, right? And the intention of the SBA loans under the PPP. So let me give it to you real quick. And again, I apologize for talking fast, everyone, but I do want to get Andy into the conversation to chat about some of those things.
Well, thank you, Yvette. Well, first, as Yvette mentioned, what makes this a little different is obviously that it's very personal. It impacts people. So from a workforce perspective, as we've been talking with clients, there really are kind of 3 things that really everyone's beginning to slowly focus on. And one is, obviously it's the immediate cash flow. It's building resiliency, which we just heard Yvette mention, and finally kind of beginning those initial steps to that turnaround as well as that rebuild. From a cash flow perspective, it's really, again, taking a look at your production and sales from a workforce perspective. You really want to ensure that your employees are showing up to work. You also want to retain some of your top performers. And I think some good examples, I'm sure that some of you have already seen occurring are, how do you retain your top sales folks that are basically no longer performing services? Or if you have manufacturing, how do you encourage your workers to show up as they're very concerned about, being a safe distance from their other coworkers in the factory? So there are these different elements that all play into kind of the decisions as you're looking at your workforce going forward. Now with that, we kind of had, as Yvette said, that juicy morsel of the CARES Act that came in, which included the PPP. If you don't take that, there's the employee retention credit, as well as the deferral of Social Security. And also for smaller companies under 500, there's the Family First paid sick leave, as well as the emergency FMLA credit as well. But kind of what we've seen is that there is a little bit of that kind of created kind of a delay in a lot of companies kind of taking more of a proactive look at their workforce. It is kind of that juicy morsel that everybody's chewing on right now, which is great, and it's helping many entities. But there are kind of those subsequent kind of planning elements that everyone should be doing with their workforce. And really what I'm getting at is kind of that cash flow. Do you need to mine for cash through your now to help you kind of build that runway out? Or do you really need to start taking a look more unfortunately aggressively in furloughing more and more folks to try to save money to kind of build that runway out so that you can continue to build resiliency? Kind of that next step, which we're already starting to have discussions about, is like, okay, as we're kind of looking ahead, as your business begins to change, it's then looking towards how do you really retain and as well as continue to attract your workforce? And with that, there's going to be a kind of a complete kind of re-look or redo of a lot of your compensations and benefits programs and philosophy. I mean, obviously the sales numbers have been impacted across the board, but how do you continue to incentivize some of your employees, your executives, especially your sales folks, so that they can again be and have that incentive to go out and continue to build your sales kind of in that rebirth phase. So really, that's where a lot of the conversations that we're having as we're working with employees and employers to try to develop kind of that short as well as that long-term path for all their workforce.
So Rachel, I guess we should turn it back over to you.
That's fantastic. Sorry, I was just taking all of that in because I know you had to move through it rather quickly, but that is an incredible amount of information that is so helpful right now. And if I'm correct, we're going to put together a webinar with you all to try to get this information out more broadly. So everyone on the call, don't worry. We've had a couple questions about whether this information will be distributed. We'll make sure that you get the video for this so that you can redo, and then we hope you'll join us. I think it's something we really do want to do a deep dive in with you all, because I think it's incredible information that's going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So I think there will be some questions coming from this, but I'll give everyone a chance to jump off. I can see people are kind of getting back to everything. So just want to say thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you to all of our speakers, especially all at the end. I know you moved through it rather quickly, but I think it's really incredible information. So thank you. And everyone have a great day.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe.